August 14th, 1946. She stands on his porch for 12 hours. The summer heat has a color here, a low baked ochre that bleeds into the wood of the porch and into the cowboy's palms when he rests them on the windowsill. Cicadas make a single, steady agreement with the sun. Dust hangs in the air like the slow closing of a curtain. From inside the house, through a greasy pane of glass, the cowboy watches as a figure remains on the threshold of his own property, as if it were a kind of station, unmoving, patient, not quite asking, not quite surrendering. He has seen many things. 4 years have a way of teaching a man to expect violence in the silhouette of another. Rumors, battlefield stories, late-night conversations over whiskey have taught him to scan a stranger's hands for a weapon the way a rancher checks a saddle. His first thought is a defensive one. Someone has come to test him, to provoke a scene, to make a point in a language he does not speak. In his mind, she is all rumor rendered into a shape, an emblem of everything the war taught him to guard against. But she does not move. She keeps her hands folded in front of her, fingers tucked under the cuff of a coat that has seen better days. Her head is bowed just slightly, not in shame but in a posture he cannot name. Time stretches between them like the horizon line. Noon will come and go. He will return to the window, and she will still be there. Supper will pass. Lantern light will gather, and still she will stand, as if the porch were a small island she would not leave until something was finished. If you like discovering untold corners of history, if moments of human quiet matter to you as much as battles and treaties, consider liking and subscribing. There are other small stories waiting on the edge of the map. He watches at noon. He watches at the first edge of dusk. He watches by the lantern, the yellow bulb throwing a round halo against the glass and making her face, when she lifts it, seem almost soft with relief. Each return changes nothing in her stance. Each return shifts something in him. His expectations begin to misplace themselves like a booted foot on loose gravel. She is thin, not gaunt, and her clothing is a patchwork of men's and miles. Up close he would see a tin of buttons pinned like a curio to the inside of her coat. From the window he notices the precise way her shoulders hold, and the stubbornness of a posture that will not yield to conversation it does not understand. He learns the rhythm of her presence, a careful economy of motion, the shortest gestures meant to preserve some inner measurement. There is no loud pleading here, no clamor. By late afternoon he thinks of buckets, of a stool, of water. He goes to the kitchen and comes back with a tin cup filled from the tap. He sets it on the step an arm's length away and watches. She does not drink immediately. She notices the offering and inclines her head in a way that could be thanks or an acceptance of the fact that someone has taken note of her at last. He imagines the worst, a message, an accusation, an affront. They had told him stories, soldiers' talk about what desperation could look like, how people could be made unrecognizable by hunger and rage. He had never been able to fully imagine what it would be to cross a threshold like this without purpose. But his assumptions are small children, frightened and loud, and she is a woman who has learned the feat of stillness, as if it were its own skill. When he opens the door at last, it is to a sound he had not expected, the quiet scrape of cloth. She has not spoken since she arrived. Now she lifts a sleeve and points with one finger at a torn cuff, at the frayed edge as if making a map. The word she offers is a single soft consonant, small enough that at first he is not sure he heard it. Needle, she says, English shaped by a long road and heavy seas. The pivot is simple and total. The idea of threat collapses under the specificity of need. He thinks of his mother's sewing tin, a metal box that had sat for years under a pile of rags in the back of a closet. He had not touched it in a long time. Its lid had a dent on one corner from a horse's kick, and inside the world his mother kept. Spools of thread of unlikely colors, a brass thimble dulled by use, a scattering of buttons that had once belonged to shirts no longer in fashion. He fetches it and returns to the porch, feeling a ridiculous reverence as if he were bringing a relic. She watches him set the tin on the step. Her hands move with a deliberateness that makes the moment look like a ritual. From inside the tin she selects a button perhaps the size of a small coin, though she does not need it. Her fingers find a length of thread. Her thumb presses a slender needle between nail and palm, as if it were a small, precise weapon for repair. He watches the needle's eye be threaded with the same focus he once used to empty a clip. His muscles remember readiness. They touch the glass between them once. He puts his palm there, and she mirrors him on the outside. Dry skin meeting dry skin through the pain. The contact is brief, neither confessional nor transactional. It is the geography of two people acknowledging each other's presence, without promise of more. He speaks then, in the short sentences of a man who does not want to misstep. "You want to step up?" he asks, because he has an instinct for offering small comforts that do not overreach. She nods, a movement like a small wind over the surface of water. He brings out a low stool and sets it down. She sits at last, the hours folding around her knees, and begins to work. The needle slides through cloth and pulls taut like a secret being called back into a life. Each stitch is a small event, each thread a sentence. The way she mends is not hurried. She takes time to fold the raw edge inside before pushing the needle through, to anchor each stitch with a small, nearly invisible knot. The cowboy watches, and in watching begins to unlearn the tidy categories his head had built during the war. The act she performs is not petition, it is not plea, it is the reclamation of a private world, the careful governance of a sleeve, the desire to make whole that which had become fragmented. And as she sews, the present opens like a door into the past. She was Kiyomi once of Nagoya, a child whose hands learned how fabrics could be language long before words would be enough. Her father would draw the morning sun for her on dowry paper, rings of red ink and a line of pale gold, and she would trace those circles with a stub of charcoal until her fingers were smudged. In the evenings, the family would sit in a narrow kitchen where the air carried the smell of miso and cedar. Her mother taught her to fold hems and to hide a name in a seam, a small scrap of indigo cloth, a few kanji stitched in inked threads that would read in the future like a secret signature. It was how people kept a sense of themselves when the world tilted. At 14, she had been sent to a field hospital, not in the sense of a formal nurse, but as a younger hand trained to catalog, to wash, to prepare bandages, and to pass instruments with hands that could be trusted to be steady. The work was hard and the rules were harder. They taught her to make a steady fold, to bind a wound without thinking of the face beneath the cloth. There were orders repeated like sutures: never surrender, preserve honor, keep the form of the thing even when its content had been rearranged. Those commands became a kind of armor that the body could wear when the mind dared not. When the surrender came, it was on a day marked by a radio voice and an ache in the sky she had no words for. She remembered the sudden looseness of everything, the way the world, so accustomed to a certain pressure, dropped like an old window into a room that no longer fit her. She packed what remained of her possessions with the careful economy she had learned at the hospital. A scrap of cloth with a faint stitch of her name, a thimble that had once belonged to an aunt, a small tin of buttons. Each object was a sentence she refused to let be erased. They shipped across the ocean, not on the slow, obedient tracks her family knew, but on crowded transports, where nights smelled of salt and cooking oil and the distant damp of metal. On deck, she learned the language of waiting in groups, little bundles of women sitting like a string of beads, hands working on scraps, sharing needles as if they were coins. At night, someone would hum in a tongue half remembered and half created by fear. The rhythm of that hum was like a bandage for the long dark. In those crossings, the act of sewing became a currency, a way to hold a self together while the world turned with a force they could not control. Processing in America was a bureaucracy that smelled of ink and starch and indifference. They took names, ticked boxes, assigned quarters. There were long days where faces blurred into forms, officers with clipped hair and clipped manners, women who learned to make their voices small to survive paperwork that demanded a certain way of existing. She learned to answer with the economy of someone who has been taught to fit a world defined by other people's questions. None of that history explains in a single paragraph why a sleeve matters as much as a continent. For Kiyomi, it was simpler than that. The sleeve held the piece of cloth where her name lived, a small private line that tied a life in Nagoya to the life of a woman trying to cross a new world. To mend the cuff was to stitch a continuity back into being. Back on the porch, the needle becomes a metronome for memory. The metal sings softly as it slides through cotton, a tiny metallic whisper that keeps time with the cowboy's breathing. Each stitch draws them both inward. She pauses sometimes as if a particular pull of thread has summoned a face, a place, a sound. In those pauses, he sees the small movements of someone cataloging a life, remembering who made her hems, what the dust on a kitchen floor felt like in a child's knees, the exact tone of a father's voice when he said, "Remember the sunrise." He has his own history surfacing in these moments. He had been a man who learned to fix fences and patch leather by instincts that are not far from sewing. The difference is that those repairs were always outward, for the land and for other people's beasts. Watching her now, he sees the inwardness of mending, how an ordinary hand can hold a private geography together with nothing but patience and thread. Between stitches, they speak in the smallest sentences. He fetches coffee from the kitchen and offers it in a chipped tin mug. She accepts, and when the warm drink reaches her palms, she closes her fingers around it as if gripping a small sun. He offers a blanket later in the evening, and she uses it to protect the work from breezes that want to fray what she is making whole. When she threads the needle, her fingers act without fanfare, thumb and forefinger, the practiced arc that has repaired uniforms and civilian shirts alike. Sometimes, certain colors of thread will bring out a flash of memory. The ochre of the thread and the memory of a child's kimono once dyed with a color like late summer wheat. The navy blue of a spool that returns the smell of a hospital ward soap. Each memory is a pebble thrown into the pond of now. Ripples cross the porch and find the cowboy's stillness. A flashback breaks into view. A small room in Nagoya where she is younger by years but older in the things she must learn. A sister or another apprentice teaches her to hide a name inside a cuff, a secrecy they laughed at because the world would not notice such small rebellions. They would stitch the birth of a person into an object like bearing a seed, believing that someone would one day find it and know, this one was here. Another memory arrives like a struck match, the field hospital at dusk. She remembers hands, dirty, bandaged, exacting hands, lifting a cloth to examine the seam of a soldier's sleeve, to see whether the last letter of a name was still legible. She remembers the sound of a radio calling out roll numbers, and the dull, grinding way the world reconfigured itself to accommodate a new set of rules. The needle in her hand now is kin to that other needle. It has been taught the geometry of survival. Outside, the ranch shifts with evening. Cattle settle. The barnyard breathes out a slow animal heat. The cowboy's life is made of these cyclical acts: mend what breaks, feed what eats, close what must be closed against weather. The script of his days is quiet, practical, almost ritualized. He had expected to enforce a boundary tonight. Instead, he watches an act of repair that asks nothing of him but the dignity of being witnessed. At one point, as darkness gathers, Kiyomi makes a small mistake, an errant stitch that will make a visible puck if not corrected. She frowns, not in self-blame but in the concentrated annoyance of a person who knows how much a single wrong line can distort the shape of a work. She pulls the thread carefully, undoes the errant knot, and starts again. That undoing is the small, honest labor of a life, the willingness to correct and continue. The cowboy, who has hewn wood and patched leather till his hands learn to remember the right pressure, is impressed by the same thing in her, order imposed on chaos by small, repeated acts. He sits on the steps beside her without meaning to, and does not speak. Their silences become a new kind of conversation. He learns to listen for the sound of her breath, the metallic whisper of a needle, the ticking of the night. At some point, a child of the ranch, maybe the boy next door, walks by and asks in the blunt curiosity of youth why the woman will not enter the house. The cowboy answers simply, "She's fixing what shouldn't be lost." He does not explain her history. He does not need to. The truth is clear enough to him now. She has come here for a practical thing that is also a ceremonial act. Mending is a language she knows. The porch, for reasons he does not fully explain to himself, is the place where she could do it on her own terms. Intermittently, the narrative widens. There were other women like her, the voices she had learned to rely upon in camps and on ships, women who stitched and hummed in the corners of lives that had been rerouted by war. They passed needles between them like oaths, traded patterns that became maps of survival. They sewed names into collars, into hidden linings, so that if the world tried to divide them into faceless categories, there would be at least one small proof of individuality sewn back into the fabric of their days. The sun sets and lantern fire gives way to a colder blue. When the porch light hits the last line of stitches, the cuff is almost finished. Her fingers, now steadier in the hush of night, make the finishing knot with a small private flourish. She holds the mended sleeve up as if to inspect a poem she has just finished. The cowboy sees the repaired edge and cannot help but notice the economy of what has been done. No flourish, no show. Only the precise care of someone returning a lost word to a sentence. They do not exchange speeches. She bows once, an inclination filled with more than politeness, and stands. He has the thought, absurd and humane, to offer her a pair of gloves, as if to soothe the hands that had held too much for too long. She refuses with a smile that could be read in many ways. Gratitude, a refusal to accept charity, a small agreement between two people who have recognized each other's dignity. Weeks later, or perhaps the next morning, time becomes elastic at the edge of such events. A truck arrives to take her away. It is neither noisy nor ceremonious. The driver is a man who has the job and the face of someone used to being required to move things along. She bows again once to the porch, to the stool, to the tin that had been opened and used. She places nothing on the step. Instead, she lifts the repaired sleeve to her cheek for a moment, a private benediction, then folds it neatly and tucks it back into the coat she has worn since the journey. As the truck pulls away, the cowboy stands on the porch and watches the figure recede. He finds, after some time, a loose thread on the barn floor, a small pale filament that had slipped free during the work. He picks it up and holds it between his fingers. Threads are peculiar things. They insist on continuity even when everything else is broken. He rolls it around his thumb and feels the thinness of it, the evidence that mending had taken place. The image of her walking back across country becomes lodged in him. He would think of it in years to come, the way someone could stand for a dozen hours and not ask for much except the tools to return a part of themselves to order. He would think of the light that had softened her face on the porch and of the patience with which she worked. It would not become a heroic story in the newspapers. It would remain a private emblem, a small talisman against the shrill narratives the war had produced. She had not been rescued in any conventional sense. No one had read her a speech or given her a medal. She had not been made into a lesson. She had been witnessed, which is sometimes the only graced act life allows. Someone had seen her do the work she needed to do and had not turned the act into spectacle. There are other vignettes, brief and sharp, that populate the space around what happened on that porch. A night in the hospital where Kiyomi learned to recognize the way a patient's breath quickened before words ever arrived. The first time she realized that a small patch, the wrong color, could say more about survival than an entire speech. The quiet of a ship crossing, where women sat in rows like tied bundles, needle-pointing their way through the terror of wanting to be ordinary again. These memories are not explanations so much as textures, the light fall of a memory that explains why a torn cuff had to be mended. The cowboy returns to his work that week with something shifted. He mends fences with a different attention to the edges, noticing the small phrase and the ways in which a line's integrity matters. He finds himself saving the sewing tin he had used and keeping it on a shelf in the barn. It becomes, over time, an object less of use and more of memory. Occasionally he opens it and examines the threads like a man reading an old letter. Later still, years fold over years. He will come home from some small errand and find the tin with its lid slightly askew, a dry leaf inside, and a careful arrangement of buttons that look like stars. He will think of Kiyomi and of the night the porch became a place where a woman could be an agent of her own repair. Once in winter light he will take from the tin a small cuff that had been tucked inside, perhaps left, perhaps found, and he will see the neatness of the stitches and the faint line of a name that is now a memory. He will keep it in a drawer, a relic that does not ask to be interpreted beyond its simple fact. Someone mended a thing that mattered. The remarkable part of the story is not that a woman stood on a porch for 12 hours. It is that during those 12 hours she performed a kind of labor that rewired how another person would see her. There is something incredible about the quietness of it, the way an entire history of displacement can be read in the stoop of a shoulder and in the way a hand ties a knot. To stand, to wait, to stitch. These are acts of meaning in a world that teaches people to expect dramatic gestures. The drama here is the refusal to dramatize. The extraordinary is the ordinary being insisted upon. Kiyomi's life did not end on that porch. It continued in whatever small ways a person can reassemble after being passed through the machinery of war and migration. She left the ranch with the sleeve repaired, with a tiny measure of continuity restored, and with the knowledge that someone in that stretch of country had seen the work she chose to do and had offered an object, an old sewing tin, that made that work possible. That simple exchange reshaped both of them. For her it was a reattachment to an identity she had the right to preserve. For him, it was a lesson against the ease of suspicion. Years later, when the cowboy sits on that same porch and the light leans into evening, he will remember the ready vividness of that day, the way dust smelled like an old book and how the light had framed a woman at work. He will reach into the drawer where he keeps the tin and hold a small scrap of fabric, feeling how the threads run parallel to the life he knows. It will not offer him answers about nations or politics. It will give him instead a souvenir of a human moment, something that will keep him from thinking of people as stereotypes and instead as people with hands and needs. There is a finalness to what happened, but it is not a tidy ending. The truck took her away, the porch remained, the cowboy kept the tin. The loose thread on the barn floor will fray further with time and may finally disappear altogether. But for a while, long enough for a man to tell a tale, the thread sits between his fingers like a small proof that the world still allowed repair. If this story moved you, tell us where you're watching from and which moment stayed with you most. Share this tale with someone who believes in the power of small acts to change the way we see each other. The incredible part of the story is not the standing for 12 hours itself, nor the attention it drew. It is that something as ordinary as a needle and a piece of thread could reclaim a person's name from the edges of history. It is that the porch, the place where the private meets the public, became for a brief, luminous span the threshold where a woman could return a fragment of herself to wholeness, and that a cowboy, shaped by other battles, could learn to witness rather than to wall. When he thinks of that day, when summer returns and cicadas claim the air again, he sees her silhouette against the porch light. He hears again the tiny metallic whisper of needle through cloth. He remembers how small things held up an entire life. A tin of buttons, a brass thimble, a stubborn stitch. That memory is a quiet thing, but it is durable. It is an answer to the idea that only the loud and the violent shape history. Sometimes history is stitched in quiet rooms and on creaking porches, one careful knot at a time.